All right, crowd, how you all doing? Doing well? All right, so a couple of housekeeping things. I think that there is, I don't know if you want to make an announcement about the questions. I think there's a way for you guys if you want to ask any questions. So you don't forget the question, you can text it, and then we'll actually collect all those questions at the end. Before I actually turn this to the other presentation, this is actually going to be running tonight and tomorrow. This is actually a couple of presentations about books that, I've learned a lot from these books. So if you want to actually grab any of these titles to search them after that, feel free to do this. All right, let me just change this. Okay, so this weekend is going to be a very, very special weekend, partly because I think we're going to try to tackle a very tough topic, which is the topic of biological apologetics. And it's a really, really tough one because of many reasons when you're going to look at, and I think one of the great things about this meeting is that there's a lot of familiar faces that, I can recognize, people that I've had great conversations with. And the one thing that you have to come out of this, I would love to hear back from you because I learn a lot of times when you guys ask questions, I go back and search these questions. This has been for me a learning process to go back and do my own homework and my own research about this. And I would actually start with what I want to end with, is the very famous word, in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, and in all things, charity. We can have a big debate in this whole conference and we end up losing each other, but you'll get at the end that there are some things that unite us, that some things that are absolutely essential, and those I want to make sure at the end that we have a clear understanding of. Why is this a big question? Well, number one, you can clearly, if anyone has read in the news, this is becoming a rising conflict between the church and the society. I think if there are two big things that you can think of in this current day and age that are causing a bit of conflict. Number one is civil liberties, okay? Number two is the conflict between science and religion. And I would say that conflict is a little bit of an apparent conflict. It's a little bit of a political conflict. And I would hope at the end of this retreat that I would resolve some of that conflict in your mind, that at least is not as bad as you think. When you look at actually, and I call the danger of education, you'll find something very interesting. And if you look at this, and I don't know if it's projecting pretty well, but if you actually look at the middle column, so here the middle column is like humans evolved and God had no part or process in this. Like God didn't do anything whatsoever. If you had a high school education and by the time you're done with your postgraduate degree, you had a threefold increase in people who said that God had nothing to do with it whatsoever. In fact, when you look at the other one, if you see that people who actually believe that humans have been in this present form as we know it less than 10,000 years, if you go from high school to graduate degree, that number goes to half. And by the way, these numbers are an average over the whole country. There's very well known in some very, very liberal universities, these numbers are even worse. That you go almost like if somebody has a graduate degree from some universities, their belief that God has anything to do with creation is probably less than 20 to 30%. So I call it, in some sense, well, you know what, all of us have to have an education, okay? But is that education dangerous? I don't think so. It challenges us and we need to be very well informed. But are we really under attack? And I would really try to quote the Pope or the Archpope of the atheists, that when he says, Richard Dawkins says to levy, that their intention for the militant atheists is to levy an intense barrage of ridicule at religious moderate to bully them into surrendering to atheism. I think that fence sitters are likely to be swayed by a display of naked contempt. If I get something out of this meeting, I would like to tell you that there are many scientists who are at the same level of intelligence, if not smarter than Richard Dawkins, who absolutely believe in God and absolutely believe in science and are working in the science field to advance it to a very, very high level. So there is no reason for us to be bullied. There is absolutely no ground for us to be bullied in this area. Why is this a major issue? because it's a very tough issue. It's different than when you're talking about the existence of God and the philosophical argument. Why? Because over ages, the philosophy of existence of God, has not changed dramatically. Yeah, the arguments are a little bit different. But when you're talking about science, every single day there's a lot of scientific facts. So if you make a theological assumption based on the science of today, let's say this science changes tomorrow, what are you going to do? And you have to keep up with that field so much. Unfortunately or fortunately, it is a multidisciplinary area. For you to really make up your mind, you have to be very well knowledgeable in science, very well knowledgeable in biblical studies, biblical linguistics, historical studies, in theology, in philosophy. This area, biological apologetics, is an area where many domains meet. In fact, if you look, for example, at the ID movement, some of their top people who are actually advocating it, one of them is a lawyer. Philip E. Johnson is a lawyer, okay? Another one is a mathematician. So people, for example, somebody like Stephen Meyer is a person who deals with information and the science of information. So it tells you how tough this field is to make up your mind. Why is this a major issue? Because it's a major debate in the church. If you look at headlines, actually, several headlines, evangelical professors lost their jobs from their seminaries just because they've said, well, you know what, I'm entertaining a different interpretation of Genesis. In fact, if you look at actually Bruce Waltke is one of the most prominent Old Testament scholars in the country. He had to resign his position that he had been in for so long just because he said a comment about evolution. And then when you get somebody like Pope John Paul, okay, when he embraces evolution and says, you know what, I think evolution is the way that we were created. So you can get not only the Catholic, the Protestant, and the Orthodox Church, but even within the same church, we can't even agree on that. So you want to tell me why this is a very tough subject to do? Because when we're talking about existence of God, almost all of us will be on the same page. But when we talk about evolution, I can tell you, out of this crowd, we can come up with 100 different ideas, and we can really fight about it. So rules of engagement, and this is going to be for today, for tonight, and tomorrow until Sunday. Number one, it's an area of major complexity. I can tell you, the more I've done research in this area, the more humbled I have been. And I can't really go and tell about somebody, well, you know what, they don't know what they're doing. You know why? Because they've done their research. Even if I disagree with them, like for example, I'll say the young earth creationists, I don't agree with their science, but they've done quite a bit of good science. Okay, and I have to be respectful of that. You'll know when we come into the lecture of the biblical interpretation, there are interpretations that are not going to match with what you believe in. But you got to, at least with some sense of humility, listen and learn from them, and don't just judge that they're heretical. Second thing, you have to understand and realize that within the mainstream Christianity, and I'm talking about mainstream, mainly the Orthodox, the Catholic, and mainstream evangelical beliefs, that you might, in this box, this is your belief, okay? I can tell you from now, and don't be shocked, that you will find Christians that believe in something different. It's going to overlap with your belief. You might find some overlap. But trust me when I tell you, you might find a Christian who totally believes, and they are within this box, what I call mainstream Christianity. But their belief about creation, their belief about Genesis is totally different than yours. And I would really warn you from saying that they're heretical just because of that. I don't think that's fair. Yes, there are some views outside, and I will tell you the ones outside of this box. I think that we as an Orthodox church have to really do our research and know where we're at. I don't think we necessarily have to agree with all those Christians. I don't think we necessarily need to. But I think we have to be careful about just saying they're heretical because their view on the biblical interpretation or their view on evolution is different. The purpose of this is not to convince you with one view or the other. I'm not going to try to convince you with my view. I'm going to present to you today and tomorrow and on Sunday the opposing views for evolution on both sides as well as biblical interpretation. What you need to do is you need to do your research. I've given you a lot of books. I'll give you a lot of ideas. You need to go and do your research and do it well before you make up your mind. What I want to get out at the end is that if you wherever field you're in, if you're in scientific area, that would be great. If not, if you're in law, if you're in public service, whatever it is, I want you to come out of this with a cohesive, unconflicted opinion of evolution and creation. And when I mean cohesive, that you don't feel inside yourself that there is something that doesn't make sense. The problem what you guys face in college, what you face in university, is that you find a lot of people that tell you it doesn't make sense. They put inside you a confusion. And at the end when you're confused and you don't get the answers, you lose faith in the Bible, in the church, in everything. And I don't want that to happen. The bottom line, and this is what I'm going to actually end with, no matter what your belief is about the details of Genesis, no matter what you believe about the details of evolution, there are 3 facts all Christians in this debate agree upon. And if you agree on those 3 facts, I think that will be all that what it takes. And trust me when I tell you, the simplest man and woman in the villages, in the places that we go and serve, believe in these 3 facts and are saved based upon them. Those 3 facts. Number 1, God created all. That's it, simply. You can go and ask somebody in the village and tell them how. He'll tell you, like, you know what, I don't really care. I'm not telling you that we have to completely ignore it. If you want to search it, that's fine. But you know what? The details of the how doesn't take away from the fact that God was created it. Number 2, God created all good for good. One of the biggest problems about the Darwinistic view of evolution is that the process is so random and the outcome is so unpredictable that it could be either good or bad. And by the way, because you fall sick and you get a cancer and you die at the end, and that is evil, so then God did not create it, because how can He create something that is good? That is a wrong assumption. When God created, it created it all good. And number 3, God created all good for us to enjoy the relationship. There is a sense of glory, and you will look at actually this debate that actually there is a big part about who you are and how you believe that God looks to you and relates to you. It's not only that God created it, it's not only that God created all for good, it is God that created all for good so that you would enjoy this glorious relationship with Him. So you and I can disagree about the details of evolution. You and I can disagree about the details of how to interpret Genesis. But I hope at the end that we agree on all those 3 things. That's the bottom line. So how is this weekend going to go? Well, there are going to be 4 lectures, and I'm going to have to actually walk you through this because there is a lot of thought process. It's very easy for me to come and tell you right now the argument with or against evolution, but I think this is just actually going to be an argument in vacuum. You need to understand the background. You need to understand the history behind it. So you can really make sense when you're, let's say you adopt evolution, okay? You have to understand where did this argument come from. So the first lecture is that your worldview determines how you think and your conclusion. I will tell you something, guys, and trust me when after a lot of research, I figured out something really interesting. You can be looking at the same exact scientific results, same exact ones, and come up with a completely different conclusion about God creation because of your assumptions and your presuppositions and your worldview. So when you're debating with another person, it's not necessarily you're debating the science, you're debating their philosophical assumption, which is very important. So number 1, your worldview determines your conclusions. The second lecture for tomorrow, biological evolution. The pros and the cons, okay? And I'm going to present to you from a scientific standpoint, how do people who favor evolution from a Christian standpoint, how do they defend it? And trust me when I tell you, they've got some really, really good arguments. How do people who are against evolution are against it and why? And they've got some very valid arguments. So that's going to be tomorrow morning. And then the third one would be Genesis. I've actually debated quite a bit which one to start with. Whether to start with evolution first or the Genesis first. I decided to go with evolution first. You know why? Because the Christians who look at evolution and they come up with theological answers, a lot of them start from the point of where you're at. They're in the scientific field and they're struggling with the data. And I want you to look at the data first. I want you to look at the scientific data. But then I want to actually culminate with looking at Genesis 1 to 3. And basically, can we reach an agreement? That is going to be tomorrow afternoon. And then the last one, which is very, very, very dear to my heart. Our past, our sense of creation and evolution, honestly determines a lot of what we are right now. And we're going to talk a little bit about the issue of biomedical ethics and biological ethics. Does evolution impact how we look at abortion? Does evolution impact how we look at contraception? Does evolution impact how we look at stem cell research? Does evolution impact how we look at end-of-life care? Does evolution look at eugenics? And can we make out of ourselves superhuman beings? Is that okay? Well, some people are going to say yes. Some people within the mainstream Christianity are going to say, why are we against advancement? It has been labeled that Christianity, we're against scientific advancement. Is that the case? And I labeled this last lecture, this is going to be Sunday, that as we're going to look into the past of our evolution and our creation, it's going to impact a lot of how we're going forward in this country with a lot of debates going on. I always say that God does not need defending, but people need to understand. God is able to defend himself, but we need to be well informed, just like Peter said in his first epistle. Be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you. I can tell you, when you go to your own college and an atheist scientist will come and tell you you can't believe in science and believe in God, I'll tell him, you know what? It's not yours to take away. I can believe in my science. In my area of interventional cardiology, I deal with science every day. I deal with life and death every day. I deal with the most advanced things in medicine that anyone can use. I deal with life and death that when I shock somebody out of death, I revive them. And I'm a big believer in that, and I will do it every day of my career. But I also believe that what I've been given as a gift of God. And I enjoy that gift. And I enjoy the fact that when somebody's revived from their death by our medical technology, I enjoy that that's a gift of God. But when I lose the battle and that person dies, I never make a God out of myself. It was not mine to revive. I never make a God out of myself. That's the problem with modern medicine. That's the problem with modern technology. It is a great gift, but we can make a God out of it. And that's an issue. But don't let anyone to tell you that modern science cannot be enjoyed with the same way that you enjoy your Creator. Pontius Pilate asked Christ many, many years ago, 2,000 years ago, what is truth? And this is still the question. And I would tell you, why do you need to care about the truth as an introduction? I think it's a matter of identity. I think one of the biggest things you're going to come out of this is who you are. I don't believe that the process of how you're created is the primary way of looking at who you are. I think it's one of them. But when God tells you, you are my child, you are an heir, you are the royal priesthood, you are the chosen people, there is many, many, many messages He's giving us to there than just an evolutionary biologist who's telling you, you are the product of a random process that didn't even have you in mind. I think that's the biggest problem. When somebody comes and says that that process did not have you in mind, I think at that point he's not studying the science. He's philosophically judging that process. There's nothing in the science of evolution that can tell you whether or not that the outcome would have been guaranteed or not, because that cannot be scientifically proven. I think it's a matter of meaning, and I think this matter of meaning, if you believe you're a child of God, if you believe you've been put on this earth for a certain authority, you've been entitled a certain role, you will look very carefully about those bioethical dilemmas. You will look at the meaning of life differently. You will look at the value of life differently. You will look at the value of a personhood differently. I have very hard time against one of the most prominent bioethicists in the world in Princeton, Peter Singer, who says that a mentally handicapped person is not a person anymore. And that a chimp or a gorilla who can actually learn some tricks is more of a person than a mentally handicapped. I have big trouble with that. With all due respect, he is a very, very well respected bioethicist, and he has got amazing contribution to give to society. But I think his definition of personhood and its meaning is very, very problematic. And lastly, I think when you look at where you came from, it's going to be a big time determining where you're going to go. I think there is a matter of destiny there. If you believe you're a product of random chance, if you believe you're a product of just mere dust, and it ends, the material world ends with your death, there is nothing that survives you. What are you looking forward next? I think your destiny is a big question. And destiny is not only a philosophical question. I think it's a biological question. Because where you were created from is going to determine where you're going to go after that. So I think it is a very, very strong biological question. And I always tell people, Pascal had a wager. I'm sure you guys know of it. But he was struggling with this. He was struggling with the unknown. And he made a wager. He said very simply, well, you know what? Let's say you're an unbeliever in God. Okay? You don't believe in God's existence. Well, you're going to gamble. If you gamble that God doesn't exist, and he doesn't exist, well, you win. Good for you. But let's say there's 1 out of 10 chance he might exist, and you find out in eternity, you lost big. Let's say you're on the other side, that you actually believe that God exists, and you put all you wager everything that God exists, and you end up that, you know what, truly he exists. You won it all. Let's say hypothetically he doesn't exist. What have you necessarily lost? Not much. The problem is that nowadays there is a third option, and this option is becoming really, really troublesome, called the agnostic. And surprisingly, even within science, because of the challenges of science, because of the uncertainty of science, because of the lot of enigmas that science present to us, you get both competing sides. A lot of scientists right now don't like what Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris are doing. They don't like this kind of extreme atheism. Why? Because they would be honest with themselves and say, you know what, we don't have enough information to be that extreme as you are. Hence, we will prefer to be agnostic and say, you know what, I just don't know from a scientific standpoint. Okay, I'm a scientist. I'm trained to look at evidence. I'm trained to look at experimentation. I'm trained to look at data. If you show me the data that God exists, I might accept it. But since there is no data that can do that, I'll be an agnostic. And I don't know. And they think it is actually okay to be neutral. But I don't believe that that neutrality is sustainable. I always give the example of living in Minnesota, or even up here, when you guys had in Buffalo, what was it, like 6 feet, in one night? Let's say you're up camping, up on the mountain, and you get a snowstorm. And this snowstorm is said, you know what, it's an avalanche. There's just absolutely, it's going to wipe out everything on there. And then you're given an option of 2 roads. One road that either takes you to a cliff where you'll fall to your death, or the other road takes you to base camp safely. And you got to pick one of those 2 roads based on your best intention, best knowledge. It's a wager, just like Pascal's wager. Either you fall to your death, or you get to base camp. That would be the atheist and the believer. You know what would the agnostic do? He'd say, I don't have enough information. I'm just going to stay in the snowstorm up there. Well, what's your destiny? You're going to end up dying as well. So I do not believe that agnosticism is in of itself, by staying neutral, is safe. Because God has given us enough information to make up our minds. So when he asked, what is truth? Pascal also said something very interesting. People almost invariably arrive at their beliefs not on the basis of proof, but on the basis of what they find attractive. And he said this, and 200 to 300 years after that, it's becoming very more true. In this debate, in this country, people are getting to the truth on basis of what they want to hear. When you look at actually knowledge in this side of the world, knowledge is very interesting. There is actually a whole field of study called epistemology. How do people know? And if you make knowledge as a scale from impossible to certain, okay, 0 means that there is absolutely no knowledge, okay, we cannot get to anything, and 1, you're absolutely certain. The agnostic will tell you it's impossible. You can't know anything. The skeptic will tell you that everything is unlikely. The dogmatic would tell you it's certain. And underneath that, I would say some very, very strong opinionated atheists. They're absolutely certain. You can tell them, well, did your science give you that inclination? There's nothing in science that you can say that disproves God. But yet, they're absolutely certain. Would you like to know where do I put the faithful, the believer? I don't put them at 1. I put them at here. Likely. Because faith is not knowledge. Faith is in the unseen. In this world, is likely. If we had all the knowledge that we would be certain, we would not be in this world right now. We would be up there. And surprisingly, that kind of jump from likely to certain, that same faith exists for the believer and the non-believer. So the non-believer, just like the famous book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, the atheist sometimes goes on that faith from being likely to certain, say, you know what, I'm absolutely certain that God does not exist. And today, in this weekend, I'd like to give you some more information to really get our sense from a believer to actually believe the outcome. When we search truth in this field, we always start with presuppositions. Presuppositions are what? Are your assumptions, where you come from. If you are anti-God, you know what? You're going to start from that point, no matter what people tell you. You're going to go and have some fact-finding and revelation. And I call it fact-finding. You're going to go as a scientist, you are going to go and find the facts. But there's also revelation, the biblical revelation. Because that same biblical revelation that is in the Bible is available for everyone, no matter what your presupposition is. And then you come up with your beliefs. The problem becomes when we cycle this. When your presuppositions, you've already made up your mind even despite all the evidence that exists, and this is what I would caution you. Despite all the evidence that is given to you, you already made up your mind. No argument is good enough for you. So you have your presuppositions, you go and find the facts, and then you end up in your beliefs, and those beliefs end up enforcing what again? Your presuppositions, that God doesn't exist. That's the most dangerous cycle. And I would tell you very, very carefully, when you are at least debating, or when you are actually studying, a lot of us go at the facts and try to look at the facts and debate people with the facts, but we don't realize that they already have the presupposition from before it. So now, I'm going to give you a story of history. If you want to know how did this modern debate come, so when tomorrow we talk about evolution, you have to know how we came to this. And I'll tell you something, you'll find it extremely interesting when you read the history of faith versus nature. And I don't like verses, because verses sometimes puts them against each other. But you look at that history, it is very, very impressive. You know why? Because there are three lines of thought there. There's always the study of God, the theology. How do you look to God? There's the study of nature, which comes by observation, comes by science, and then absolutely embedded into this, your human existence. It is such an amazing, intricate trichotomy that everything you think of in terms of nature will affect how you believe in God. Everything that you think of God and your nature is going to affect how you believe of yourself. I'll give you a very simple example. If I'm a complete naturalist, complete materialist, then you know what? I don't believe in God. And you know what? When I look at human existence, humanity is all what it is. Humanity is all what it is. Now let's start the story from ancient times. In ancient view, from God's perspective, it was a polytheistic society. There were so many gods. You look at the Egyptian gods, you look at the Sumerian gods, you look at the Roman gods, you look at the Athenian gods. There were so many of them. When it came to nature, most ancient people believed that nature was a tool for the gods to either punish them or reward them. That's how they looked at nature. For them, it was so intricately tied to their perception of God. That's why they used to worship their gods. If you always look at the ancient Egyptians, what they would do in some of the feasts, they will take a young woman, throw her in the Nile so that the flood of the Nile would not damage their crops. That was their perception at that point. And then your perception of yourself, humanity is just a slave to the gods and at their mercy. That was the ancient view. And in fact, you'll find it very interesting, and some people would actually sometimes balk at this, like, you know what, atheism in terms of its modern definition did not even exist in the ancient world. It was not even there. There was a couple of different variations in the ancient view, and this goes into nature. There was the Gnostic view, which looked at nature in terms of dualism. Nature itself and matter was evil. The spiritual was okay. And that's one of the reasons why the Gnostic heresy in the church was very problematic, because they did not think that God can incarnate and take our flesh. So matter was evil. And humanity should do everything it could do to get rid of matter. You had the Epicureans who believed that the universe was eternal. When you look at the classic view, so the first time that this classic view in all the ancient civilizations, which is really amazing, that it would change was in the Judeo-Christian faith, where in this God, there was only one God. And God created nature as a gift and a blessing for humanity. And humanity was made in the image of God. That was the first time in the history of civilization that nature became a tool of blessing, not a whipping tool from the gods to people. This viewpoint dominated from the time of Christianity, spread to almost the medieval times, when you get Augustine, who actually said the 4 points. When he looked at truth, Augustine said it very clearly. You know what? There is no dichotomy of truth. There is no scientific truth or natural truth versus the biblical truth. It's all one truth. You can't have confusion. There are 2 books of truth. There is a book of scripture and a book of nature. There is the Bible and there is nature in front of you that God has given to us. He's the first that said that both books need interpretation. He was the first that said, you know what? In terms of the biblical interpretation and nature, you got to be careful. In fact, Augustine was one of those that at that time, if our biblical interpretation, not the text, if our biblical interpretation collides with a scientific accepted fact in the age that we live, our interpretation has to be revised, but not the text. Very big difference between the biblical text and the interpretation. And tomorrow afternoon we'll talk a little bit about the biblical interpretation and how our Orthodox Church does it. At the end, in terms of those 2 truths, the spiritual facts are superior. But he said something very, very beautiful. I believe so that I may understand. And I understand so that I may believe. There is no conflict. There's not you're living a life of a student in college and enjoying your rationale and your logic and your sciences and the beauty of what is given you, and then you've got another life here in the church. They're not separate. You believe that you may understand, and you understand that you may believe. Things started to get a bit messy in the Middle Ages, because at that time when people looked at God, they looked at naturalism, which believed that, you know what, nature was all in all, that's what it took, versus other people who looked at supernaturalism, that every single thing, if it rained, it was God. If it didn't rain, it was God as well. So people went from the extreme of being supernaturalist to the extreme of being naturalist. And in between, there was this whole concept of occasionalism. When does God interfere in nature? The problem is that they started to realize, well, is God the primary cause of nature or is he a secondary cause? Until you got to the 16th and 17th century showdown. You got Copernicus. And Copernicus at that time said, you know what, my science doesn't make sense that the earth is at the center of the universe. It is the sun that is at the center of the universe. And then it took another generation until Galileo came. And then they had this big debate on the verse in Psalms 104, verse 5. He set the earth on its foundation, it can never be moved. And that's what Galileo was trying to tell the church at that point. Yes, there are a lot of modern depictions right now of Galileo being persecuted by the church. It is not as bad. There's a lot of people just fueling that conflict. But there is no question that there was a tension between the interpretation of the text and the scientific evidence. Because the church at that point, the interpretation, they said that, you know what, our interpretation that the earth doesn't move. And Galileo would tell them, well, based on what Copernicus did, based on all the observations we're seeing, the earth is moving, guys. And in fact, it's the sun that is the center that we are moving around. But at that time, this was the first time on a big scale. You got to really be careful with this because this is very important in the history. On a big scale where you start to see a split between the scientific community and the church. Because prior to this, all the scientists were actually people anointed by the church. They're in fact endorsed by the church. In fact, a lot of things, the scientific findings they will get, the church would take it, look at how wonderful and beautiful our God is. And the church and the science were actually going hand in hand. But this was the first time that there was a conflict between them. And then you come to the Enlightenment, the 17th and 18th century. And you find a complete revolution in the findings of natural laws. You find Bacon, Boyle, Paley, and Newton. All those guys, what did they do at that time? They figured out mechanisms. You find geology. Nicholas Steno at that point started to come up. The first dinosaurs, he started to look at all these fossils and bring them up. And all of a sudden, they start to look as like, you know what, this is not making sense. What Newton did at that point, he figured out a law of nature. And then they came up with what's called uniformitism. What is uniformitism? Is that if the laws are uniform, if I'm seeing it here, it should apply there. So if the apple drops from the tree here because of the law of gravity, then over there, this apple tree, the apple should fall. And it fell now, you know what? 100 years ago, it should have fallen also. Because the laws are what? Uniform. So then this guy Steno started to make some kind of little bit of problem. Because he would say, well, you know what? You look at the rocks, you look at the fossils, you look at the soil. When he tried to duplicate how they would layer, he found that it was taking a lot more time than he anticipated. So he said, if the current rocks and the current sediment is layering at this rate, and I see a rock with all these layers, then this rock is probably about 40 to 50,000 years old, not 6,000 years. So all of a sudden, laws of nature are being found, and these scientists are saying, if it's a law of nature, it should apply everywhere, anywhere, all the time. Hence, you get, in the same time, Bishop Ussher of Ireland said, based on his calculations of the biblical text, the beginning of creation occurred on Saturday, October 22nd, 4004 BC. In fact, he said in his book, it was in the evening of Saturday, October 22nd, that's when creation started. You see the conflict? You get some scientists who are actually still very close to the church, but then you get somebody who's announcing something that is completely opposite to that. And then it gets worse. Here when the fun starts. Why? Because the mechanisms are found. The mechanisms are related to what? Materials, related to laws of nature. And this materialism ends up being determinism. What does determinism mean? That, you know what? If you are on top of the building and you jump off the building, you are determined to fall. So laws of nature are what? Are determined. And if they are determined, what has God got to do with that? Right? So the split in the thought process is coming to this. And then you get at that point all the Enlightenment people, skepticism, man is more knowledgeable, empiricism, empirical, like, you know what, you have a theory, give me an empirical proof of that. Rationalism, all of a sudden you get this dual, there is something called faith and something called reason. And by the way, reason is far more what? Enlightened than faith. You end up with something very, very, very troubling. It's the first time that you find this term called deism. What is deism? It is a belief in God. It does believe that God exists, but it believes that God set the earth, set the laws, and just removed his hand. He's not involved. He said the law of gravity, and that's it. Gravity takes over. He said the law of motion, and it's over. He said the days and night, and then it's over. Deism is basically a removed God. So what is the first step in atheism? You make God what? Irrelevant. No use of it. No, you don't have a use for him. He set the laws, and that's it. What caused this to happen is that when they discovered the laws of nature. And then you get this really interesting complex dilemma. When you see an organism that is so beautiful, you find somebody like Mendel who's a monk, he looks at the genetic inheritance and he looks at it as like, wow, this is so cool. And then you find William Paley who actually talks about, you know what, the watchmaker. He makes this analogy, if you are going on the shore and then you find a rock, and on this rock there is another rock, well, you're not going to say, well, who brought this rock here? Why? Because it's in its natural habitat, right? It's just a rock and a rock. But let's say you find a watch, and you find the watch on the rock. You are not going to say, well, it just came on here. You're going to say, who made this watch and who brought it over to this? And that's why he was called at that time that God was the divine watch. He made the watchmaker. So then by analogy, whenever you see a complex organism, whenever you see something that is really intriguing in terms of an organism, you would attribute it to the divine watchmaker. But then you get somebody like Darwin who didn't necessarily agree with that. It's kind of very interesting when you look at actually how the history of sciences evolved. The natural sciences, so physics, laws of gravity, laws of motion, laws of astronomy came first. But then you get biologists who looked at this, well, you know what? If the astronomy has its laws and gravity has its laws, then biology has its laws. And that's what Darwin asked. He asked, can there be laws for biology that do not need an intervention of God? And that's when he came with the theory of everything, and it became a big debate. But all of it was coming to the point of, what do you do with a complex organism? Very quickly, we came into the 18th and 19th century. Naturalism. Now, everything can be explained by natural because we explained astronomy, we explained we explained the law of Newton's, and now we explained even biology. So materialism is there, and if materialism is there, since we can see it, have any one of you seen God? No. But you've seen something fall. So since we can see and we can establish those facts, then the only facts that count are material facts, and that's the certainty of truth. And then you counter this also with humanity, because by the way, you get a philosopher on one side, and this philosopher doesn't like God. So when he sees Darwinism coming up, all of a sudden he thinks of what? I exist. That's all what counts. Now existentialism came. And in the meantime, rejection of supernatural. Humanism is what you end up with. What is humanism? That the only thing certain in this world is not God, is humanity, is you. And at the end, you come up with agnosticism and atheism. Look at such an amazing and intriguing journey. You've started from about 400 years prior to that with just a split between God and our understanding of science. To the point saying that, you know what, now science can explain all this, hence I don't need God. And all of a sudden atheism can come up. Yes, it started about a century prior to it with deism. When you removed God, you put him up there, and you know what, we don't need him anymore. But that was the first step. And then you go into the 20th century where everything is explained. By the way, and here's this is what I like about this, is that because all three of them feed over each other, you can be like here, where all this leads to atheism and agnosticism. But then you can go in the 20th century where you find people who are theologically starting from atheism. They're not scientists. They're starting philosophically and theologically from atheism. And they would tell you after that, you know what, everything is naturalism. There's no need for God. And there in the beginning of that 20th century is when you come with humanity is all what it takes. Darwinism explains the origin of humanity. Freud explained your behavior, and Marxism explained your society and your economics. Hence, everything in your life is explained by us. Do you need God? You don't need God at that point. That was their assumption. It came to the point that it was strict materialism. Death is inevitable. Evil is natural. Humanity is neither good or bad. The problem is that this was the prevailing thought prior to World War I. And they thought at that time, because humanity had came up with all these achievements, that you know what, everything is going to be absolutely fine. In fact, when you look at the end of the 20th century, just before the Bolshevik Revolution and World War I, there was a sense of euphoria in this whole world that humanity will flourish. Why? Because now we're in the age of reason. We figured out the laws, we figured out the origins. We do not need God. Turn century. You end up with the Bolshevik Revolution. You end up with World War I. You end up with World War II. Right after that. And what started a lot of this? Marxism. Very well known that the Nazis Hitler believed very much in Darwin selection. He thought of the Jewish race as subpar. And he said, you know what, they don't deserve to live. And that was the ethnic cleansing at that time. So that thought ended up in this. So classic Christianity, starts with theism. God exists. Study of nature, that's what we're going to talk about tomorrow. It could be either totally designed or naturally evolved. You notice the difference between the previous one. The previous one, the nature was what? Was naturalism. That's it. It is totally evolved. Here in Christianity, there are people who believe that it totally evolved and others who believe that it totally was designed. But what is the starting point? It is very careful how I'm clicking. It started with what? Theism. And then, for them, the nature is either totally evolved or totally designed. But then the philosophy of their human existence is that humanity is good. Evil was after the fall, was not there from the beginning. God did not create anything that was evil. It was all good. Death was not a necessity. And there is a belief in supernatural. You want to come to the 21st century? Here's the 21st century. You got all the systems. You've got theism, you've got atheism, and you've got pantheism that believes that nature is a dual. There's dualism. There is illusion. Your life is just an illusion. But all this came from what? 400 years of many things that have happened. And at the end, this is truth. Truth is discovered, not invented. Truth is transcultural. Truth never changes, beliefs do change. Truth is absolute. For you, and we talked about this triangle, the problem is that when you get to your beliefs, I would tell you, you have to have a healthy balance between your presuppositions and the fact I'm finding. If you are so heavy in one side, you're going to screw yourself. You're going to be so biased. If you have no presuppositions, anyone who tells you a fact, you're just going to eat it up and be very gullible. So you have to have some presuppositions. You have to have something to stand on. But here are how people do it. When you get a strict naturalist, his presupposition is that naturalism, it's all what it takes. Everything is explained by what you see. No matter what you give you about arguments for existence of God, they come out as an atheist. You get somebody who is a belief in God and naturalist. They believe still in evolution. They don't deny evolution. But for them, the biblical revelation of creation, the literal sense of it, is not high on top of their list. They will come up to become either a deist or a theistic evolutionist because of where their presupposition. They still believe in God, but you know what? As much as the belief in God is there, the belief in nature is balancing it. You get somebody who believes in God, theism, but they absolutely believe in literal interpretation of the Bible. Their presupposition is that if the Bible says so, it says so. End of story. It'll be like Bishop Ussher, who said that creation started 4004 BC. And no matter what the scientific findings come, no matter what it is, because of their enormous presupposition of biblical literalism. By the way, I'm not saying believe in the Bible. We all believe in the Bible. Believe in the biblical literal interpretation. If it says 6 days, it is 6 days. And tomorrow we'll talk about that. But you end up at this point being a young earth creationist. And I'm not advocating this, but you can see that probably there is a balance there. There is a balance there. When you believe that theism and context, biblical revelation, context, the letter kills, but within a context, biblical revelation, and then scientific challenges for guided design. You're smart. You are challenging guided design. You're not saying there's no design. You're not saying that evolution doesn't exist. But you're putting a healthy balance together. I think that camp ends up being very well balanced. But you guys realize in this that you can't go out of vacuum and just go and say, I'm going to pick out a book and study arguments against evolution. You can't just do that. It's very hard. You got to understand the background. And if you're going to understand the background, not only, as I said, in terms of science, but also biblical studies, biblical linguistics, philosophy, theology. If you even want to do your job even better, go and study history, because that history of that debate is unbelievable. Because when somebody comes and tells you, you as a church persecuted Galileo, and because of that you guys are anti-science, anti-development, you can go back to your history and find out that it's blown out of proportion. Absolutely blown out of proportion. But in the same token, you have to understand how people make up their minds and their thought, and how you make it up. Just remember this triangle: presuppositions, fact-finding, end up in belief. If you are so biased from the very beginning against any fact that you'll find, what difference would it make for you? Even if that fact is against what you believe, at least give it the benefit of the doubt and study it and analyze it and see the pros and cons. If you don't agree with it, at least have a good reason why you don't agree with it. If you as a Christian would come out of this whole 3 days and come out and say, you know what, George, I'm going to be a young earth creationist, I will fully respect you if you would have done your research and have a good argument why you would do that. If you come out and say, you know what, George, I believe in evolution, I believe in biological evolution, and I believe that God supervised all that, I'll tell you, you know what, I respect you because there are some very prominent scientists in this country who believe in evolution as is and believe in God, and they've done their homework. But I'm going to tell you, when it comes from the biblical standpoint, there are some parts you're going to be challenged with. There are some verses, there are some areas, you're going to have to really do your digging in the theological and biblical studies to make sense of it. So tomorrow's two talks are going to be very, very balanced in each other. One of them is science, evolution. The other one is biblical interpretation. You can't do one without the other. At the end, your worldview shapes a lot of who you are. Thank you for your attention. Okay. Any questions? Yeah, we can open the discussion now. I know that tomorrow, especially after we talk about the evolution and the biblical interpretation of Genesis, there's going to be a ton of questions, but today was just the background work for tomorrow. Yeah, go ahead.
Anyone has questions?
Come on, no questions? It's going to be very boring. Yes. Okay.
I was talking with my friend once about William Lane Craig's cosmological argument, and how it has the two premises that the universe had a beginning and that anything that has a beginning has a cause, therefore the universe had a cause. And then the kid brought up an interesting point. He was like, he disputed the idea that the universe had a cause because prior to the singularity, there was no time or space which are essential for any cause to take place. So what do you say to that?
So the question is that about the cosmological argument, and basically going to the point that the first premise is that anything that has a beginning has to have a cause. And the question is that prior to the universe's existence, at that singularity, there was no time or space. Okay? The argument has to come in some sense that for something to happen, the force or the person or the entity that is causing it to happen has to be different and outside of the constraints of the nature of what's being caused upon. I'll give you a very simple example. There is a chair here. And this chair, part of its nature is that it cannot move by itself, right? If this chair moves, then you can make a logical deduction that whoever made the chair to move has nature or has got characteristics that are different from that chair. That thing that moves that chair could be a person, could be wind, could be a hurricane, could be an earthquake. But the characteristics of what moved that chair is different and outside of the confines that limit that chair. Otherwise, if it's within the same confines of that chair, that a chair cannot move by itself, it will never move. By the same argument, if you go about the universe, you're absolutely right. What are the characteristics of the universe? At a point in time and singularity, time and space and matter started. If you make the argument that a cause started that cause, you can name it whatever you want to name it. Could be an entity, could be a force, could be an intelligence, could be the aliens, could be God. But we'll call it a cause. But that cause has to be outside of the confines and the limitations in nature of what has started. So it will be outside of time, outside of space, and outside of matter. Or else will be limited by their confines as well. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
But why is the expansion of the universe limited? Why is that outside of its nature? We don't know what the nature of the singularity was. We don't know anything before that time. So why are we saying that it's outside of that?
It's an excellent question. And that's why you remember when I talked about the extension of knowledge. Our scientific knowledge has not allowed, with any major evidence, to find out prior to this singularity what is even existence prior to that. Hence, anyone, whether you're a scientist, a believer, or an atheist, no matter what they are, will have to make faith assumptions on what prior to the singularity was the cause or the nature of that was. That is a faith assumption. Okay? Yes?
Or we could just say we don't know. Why do we have to
Absolutely
describe
true.
an
Well, you know
answer?
what? Here's the thing. I'll be very, very honest with you. I'll say, you know what? From a scientific standpoint, absolutely, we don't know. However, saying this, if I at least come right now and say, well, I've got science that is telling me, my science has got me all the way to the point of singularity of time and energy and space called the Big Bang. Prior to that, I'm making just hypothetical assumptions that, stretch the limits. On the same side, I've got a revelation from somebody who is named God, who has, for most part, kept his word in many different things. And he came and said, I am the one who started prior to this Big Bang and started it. I can go on the assumptions of a scientist, or I can go on the revelation of what God has told me. What God has told me cannot be scientifically proven, but that goes on the continuum of knowledge within this world, which actually is scientific knowledge. It is only likely, it's not certain. It's only likely. But if it's only likely, that's only where faith comes into place. So I always tell then somebody who's struggling with this, you pick whatever feels to you that is more plausible. To me, what is more plausible is that an intelligent mind started all this. To me, it's more plausible that an intelligent mind who loves relationships and it matters to him started this. To me, if it's that much designed to that almost improbability of existence, to me that means that an intelligent mind should have been behind it. That to me is far more plausible logically than a mere random chance of a law that I cannot even find, because you always have to understand that the laws are only the laws of the nature that we can see. We've not even discovered the laws of the nature that we see to even make assumptions about a nature that we haven't seen before the Big Bang. Hence, if I look at this intelligent mind with all these descriptions, that the world is so fine-tuned and this universe is so fine-tuned, and this intelligent mind is so relational in reaching out to me that's a more plausible explanation. Now the question becomes, this intelligent mind that has reached out to you, what is his name? Is his name Jehovah? Or is his name Allah? Or is his name Buddha? Or is his name Confucius? Or is his name whatever you'd like? And I think that's where somebody needs to do their research. For me, the only one in the bosom of his Father, he has revealed him. Because he came and said who God is. And his description of who God is fits what an intelligent mind would do to such a world. Does that make sense? Sure. I think if an intelligent mind would create man with an ability to relate to each other the way that we relate to each other, that intelligent mind should be that relationship in its most beautiful picture multiplied by a million, by a billion. And if I take our most beautiful relationship, my relationship with my 15-year-old son, and I love this relationship, and I would multiply this relationship by a billion times, and I go and read in the Bible, I find that. I find that. Hence, from a logical standpoint, I would not necessarily truly believe in a theory that tries to extrapolate in laws in a state that we don't even know what it's like. But yet I would believe a revelation of an intelligent mind who came and said who he is, and then I compare with what I'm seeing in earth, and that's how I'd come up with that. But I would give you that. We don't know, but we have faith.
Thank you.
Okay. After this, maybe you can read it.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for coming. I thought that was great, especially that whole journey through history. You covered a lot of ground. It was really impressive.
Just the beginning.
Just the beginning, I know. My first question is about the gamble you talked about in the beginning between atheists and people who do believe in God. And you talked about how, well, let's say it's a 50-50 chance whether there's God or not. Why would you go on the side where if you get there, you die and there is a heaven and there is a God, then you go to hell? Why not stay on the right side just to be sure? That's the whole idea of that gamble. My first problem with that is that assumes that being an atheist means that you're a bad person, that it's evil in itself. And there are so many people who don't believe in God and still have a very strong moral code, who still know how to do very well for others, who spend their entire lives devoted to doing exactly what Jesus did when he was here. It's really hard to take that and understand that, okay, God is still going to punish those people because they made a gamble on the wrong side, even if they spent their entire lives living it better than most Christians do. So I have several questions. That's my first one.
Okay. Let me answer that one. It's a beautiful question. I think one of our fundamental problems is that we have a bit of wide variety of interpretation of what quote-unquote hell is. Okay? Here's how I view it, especially when I'm talking to somebody like that. I think that heaven, in its prime description, is the knowledge and the personal relationship with God face to face. When Jesus came and said, you know what, that they may know you, it's talking to the Father. This is eternal life, that they may know you, and ya'rifuk. When the virgins came and knocked on the door, what did he say? I do not know you. I think we tend to limit hell and heaven in terms of a punishment and reward. I think this is part of it, but it's not the only part, and I don't believe it is the prime part. I think the prime part is knowledge of God and knowing God. And to me, the reason why we as Christians who are baptized make it to heaven, it is not just because of good deeds. Yes, we are judged on our deeds, but it's primarily because Christ, through him being our Savior, has given us the chance to know God. This is eternal love, that they may know thee. So, how do you take it from the other side of the argument? The moral person who has done a lot of moral stuff, but said, I don't want to know God in this picture. I just don't want to know him. I've decided that he doesn't exist, or even if he exists, I do not want to have this relationship. At that point, in eternity, and please, let's excuse the names, because sometimes the names have a connotation with them that is so fixed in our mind that we can't take it out. Just remove the hell and heaven a little bit. But let's say we go to eternity, and God, he meets God. And God tells him, it's like, you know what? In your life, you have decided you don't want that relationship. And because I'm a God of love and a God of relationship, and everyone knows in the fundamentals of relationship of love that it cannot be forced. And if our relationship as human beings cannot be forced, it is multiplied a million times by God. And he will tell this person, you have decided it was your choice that you didn't want to have this relationship. And I will honor this. Hence, you and your destiny at that point is not with me, the true God. What is his status going to be? Yes, the Bible calls it hell. Okay, well, is it hell because they are punished, or is it hell because they find out at that time the truth of the matter? And at that point, all the regret that they have in eternity will not be enough to change it. Regret in of itself is a hell to anyone who's lived it. Regret in of itself is a hell. So at that point, God, when he condemns them to this, is it a condemnation because of punishment of what they've done, or because they have elected or part of the relationship away from him? And they said, I don't know you, God. And God said back, well, I don't know you. So in this point, I don't think it has anything to do with their deeds. Would their deeds give them any favor at that point? I'll be honest and tell you, I don't know. I don't think so. Because eternity is the knowledge of God. If you refuse that, you don't have that eternity. Okay? So the wager, by the way, is not about what you're doing and what you're not doing. The wager is about, do you believe in the existence of God? And would you want to have a relationship with that God? That's what the wager is. I don't think the wager is based on what you're doing and not doing. Does that answer your question to some extent? You may not agree with it, but that at least the answer I would tell you.
Yeah, no, thank you. We can talk about it later.
Sure.
Do I have time to ask one more question?
Sure.
I don't want to be greedy here. Okay. This has to do with the environment and climate change and what we've done to the world. Sometimes I think about the fact that humanity has done a ton of damage to this natural world that God has given us. The beautiful world that he's given us, we've exterminated species, we've done a lot of damage to the ozone layer. I know there are people in this country who still deny climate change and the damage that has been done to the environment, but I would say it's a pretty well accepted fact across the scientific community. Sometimes I think that it might even be a form of service that churches and Christians should feel very strongly about, wanting to serve the environment and take care of it and fight this trend. We always think about services helping other human beings and helping the poor, the sick, whatever it is. It seems to me that one of the biggest sins possible is to do damage to this beautiful world that God gave us, that came before us and has been here for hundreds of thousands of years, millions, what am I talking about, millions of years. And that's not something that really gets talked about much in Christian circles, in religious circles at all. So I just wanted to see if you had any ideas on kind of the relationship. How should we think about our beliefs in terms of our relationship to the environment, and what should be done about all the damage that has been done?
I think that you're bringing up an excellent point, and I could not agree more with you. Because basically, if you go to the very first account of Genesis 1 and 2, when you look at any book, the first chapter of the book defines what the book is about. And the first part of our book that is called the Bible, Genesis 1 and 2, God created man on honor and in dignity. Okay? And the first task that man was given was to have dominion. What is dominion? It's not to abuse. It is to be a steward. It's to be a steward. I think the fact that God brought the animals to Adam to name them, he's telling Adam, you are responsible. You should know them one by one because you gave them their name. I think God entrusted Adam at that point that he will care, humanity will care for creation. You know what was the curse that came after fall? Adam was not cursed. What was cursed? What? The earth. ملعونة الأرض. The earth was cursed. You're absolutely right that it was our sin that brought the curse and the trouble on this earth. And from that point on, we did horrible. In the redeemed state, when we are redeemed now as the people of Jesus Christ, yes, we have to reverse that cycle to go back to pre-fall where we were entrusted with this creation. And you find very well that St. Paul talks about it in Romans, that all creation is groaning, waiting for its liberation. When is that going to happen? Well, when we as Christians take back charge and when Christ will come. But he made it very clear that the creation is groaning for that. So are we responsible for this? Absolutely we are. Should we do something about it? Each one in their own microcosm as well as a macrocosm? Absolutely. I think very, very much like very simple, like, just taking care of recycle stuff. It can go from very simple things. I think we as Christians sometimes, and don't get me wrong, but sometimes we as Coptic Christians tend to think of our life as primarily the eternal life. It's going to happen. It's going to come. Don't worry. Don't worry. But until then, you've got 70 or 80 years of being a steward. You know what the word steward means? You're entrusted on this. Whether it's your environment, your house, your money, your job, your family, everything that you do, you're absolutely entrusted on it. So thank you for this comment. I would just go back and read again Genesis 1 and 2, and you will find that God's message was absolutely clear to humanity, what they're supposed to do. Hanny, there are a couple of questions up there. You want to? Yeah. I can't see them. Oh, there are more questions there, okay.
I have a little bit of a faith-based question. You mentioned earlier to read, and educate yourself on this. Where did you, maybe if you can use yourself as an example, where did you find the strength maybe when you were reading to rely on your faith and don't let it sway that and your beliefs? Because this is fantastic. I can be surrounded in a church, right, and we can have this conversation, and I'm surrounded by icons to remind me like what I believe in and God and where my faith comes from. But if I'm home alone in my room and I'm picking up this book, what is to prevent me from swaying my ideas or my religion, and how do I ground that? How did you ground that when you were doing your research?
That's a great question. I think that a couple of things. First of all, I don't usually read these or do this kind of research in isolation. No, these ideas need to be bounced back, need to have a group, and you guys have a great group here. So bounce back. So I know you're reading it by yourself, but the ideas or whatever you struggle, bring it back and discuss. And I think we encourage churches, and I know that a lot of churches are doing this, to have this open atmosphere. When somebody comes and tells you, you know what, I don't believe in the way you guys interpret Genesis. Well, you know what, let's come and talk. You don't necessarily need to be ostracized and kicked out of the church because of that. Okay? That's number one. Number two, I think the belief that within, you remember that box I showed you? I truly believe within this box that there are extremely well-meaning and believing Christians who are doing their homework and their research in all these areas, whatever it's science, biblical studies, or whatever you think of, and come up with different conclusions. That was very reassuring for me, because I can come up with a different conclusion, but the three fundamentals have not changed. That God created out of nothing for good and for man's glory. On top of this, I think, and this tomorrow I'm going to touch base very briefly on it, this whole area, I think, of our church tradition. Okay, I do believe that at the end, no matter how I struggle, I come back to our church tradition, and I look at it, and then I look at it in terms of a sense of a bit of ignorance. I am ignorant, no matter what. And that ignorance, despite me struggling with a lot of things, brings me back to my foundational faith. That, you know what, I'm still struggling to find an answer, but I'll still continue to believe in what I was brought up with until I find an alternative answer. Does that make sense? Like, I'm not going to be swayed. I'm going to go back out of ignorance, not humility. I'm not humble. I'm ignorant. Okay? But that ignorance will bring me back to my foundation until I find a more compelling answer. Okay? Yes?
That actually brings me to another question. How do you view it from, like, let's say an atheist who goes on a similar journey and they're always going back to that foundation? Like, it's...
That's a great question. And I would tell you, if any one of you has really talked to atheists, you have to have a lot of respect and sympathy for them. Partly because they're so much attacked by righteous people from right and left who tell them you're just going to burn in hell. I can't tell you how many times Richard Dawkins talks about this in debates and says, what kind of God do you guys want me to believe in when I get every year tons of letters from well-being Christians who tell me, hey, burn in hell? So that's my number one. Number two, I think you have to really try to understand from them very, very much. You remember that cycle of presuppositions and fact findings. If you can come with a discussion with them and really point that a lot of their decisions and beliefs that have been made because of their presuppositions, not because of the facts. If you get them to realize this in of itself, I think you've helped them a lot. And when I say help them, you're not trying to win and conquer them and just take them in a knockout. Knockouts don't work. There's no need for a knockout. You're trying to help them. And if I can try to help somebody to understand how he is or she is thinking about these matters, you've done them a service. If you can just show them that their presuppositions is what's causing them to make these assumptions or these decisions and believe, not necessarily the facts, and you're bringing them a lot of facts, you have absolutely put them in the right direction. But I think it takes a lot of sympathy, a lot of respect, and a lot of prayer more than anything else. Yes? Okay. That's okay.
I meant to ask this before. Anyway, the presuppositions thing. I mean, aren't we doing the same exact thing right now? Aren't we starting with God created all for glory, for good and for men's glory? I mean, isn't the whole point of this not really to be objective? You know, if that's the way we're going to go about this discussion, that kind of sounds like we're starting with the conclusion already. We already know this, and you know, how do we make all the science work in our favor then? I mean, if we were going to go about this subjectively, we wouldn't suppose anything at first. We would, start off assuming maybe it is a 50-50% chance that he existed or not. It just seems to me that, you talked about a personal search for truth. I don't want it to be personal. I want it to be the right one. I don't want to do what's comfortable for me. I don't want it to be what I want it to be. I want to know exactly how it is, even if I don't like that reality. So it's this is what
Great
happens.
question. It's a great question. So there's no doubt in my mind that every one of us starts with some presupposition. I guess the whole point is that how much weight on a dynamic basis you are viewing these presuppositions and evaluating the facts that you're getting there. Give you an example. So when I look at the existence of God, yes, I have the biblical truth. But to me, if I'm looking at it from a very objective sense, the biblical truth is one of them. It could be a primary in my case, but I have the ability to put it back for some time and then look at the evidence from astronomy, from cosmology, look at the evidence from philosophy, look at the evidence from other domains, look at the evidence from logic. Put all these together and then put the biblical fact to complete it there. Let me give you another example. So if I'm evaluating evolution, okay, I would start from the presupposition. I could start the presupposition that tells me that, the Bible tells me everything that I need to know about evolution and creation. I could start with the presupposition and say that, the Bible doesn't tell me anything about the details and scientific details of creation and of evolution. And let me look at the facts, and I'll come up with a different answer. But the reality is that when I look at an atheist who looks at science and claims that science has led him to believe that God does not exist, I think there is a fallacy there. Okay? Because on the other side, if I take a scientist who is a believer in God, who looks at science and comes up with the conclusion that, evolution makes sense. He doesn't take that conclusion that evolution makes sense to prove that God exists. He takes that God exists from what he's learned from the Bible. You see what I'm saying? So the atheist, like somebody like Richard Dawkins, is making a leap of faith from science into philosophy of existence and into theology without any solid basis because of his presupposition that God should not exist. While somebody like Francis Collins, who's the head of the NIH project, okay, and the Genome Project, I'll talk about him tomorrow. When he looks at the genome and he comes up with the conclusion that evolution is a very, very valid scientific fact, he does not take that then to support that God exists. But he takes that God exists because of what the biblical revelation told him. You see the difference? So the difference is not necessarily only on how you view your overall thought, but I'm talking, let's say when you're evaluating evolution as science. What presupposition are you evaluating this scientific evidence? If you're evaluating as a neutral, objective scientist, your conclusions should be very valid scientifically, period. However, if you are an atheist who's looking at this and come up with the conclusion that this evolutionary mechanism proves that God does not exist, I can tell you that your presupposition swayed your decision. not the science. Why? Because the science itself has nothing in it that tells you that God does not exist. But I'll also give you that the science has nothing in it that tells you that God does exist. Where do I, as a Christian, come up with the conclusion that God does exist? From the biblical revelation. I enjoy God's existence in nature. I enjoy God's existence in logic. I enjoy God's existence when I see something like the anthropic principle and I see how minute it is, and yet we exist. This is beautiful. I enjoy that. But does not necessarily prove to me that God exists. Does it make sense to you? I know for some people, the presence of this proves to them that God exists. But I would tell you, if you're just a scientist, looking at it from a scientific standpoint, I'm not talking to you about being a man of faith or a man or a Christian person. You are a scientist at this point. I don't think from the scientific standpoint you can make that assumption. So hence, my objection to somebody like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins is when they use the scientific data to make the conclusion that God does not exist because of what we found in science. That is wrong. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so that's where the presupposition I object to. Yes?
Yeah. I also have an issue with the presupposition thing, and thank you, Kira, for bringing that up. My issue is that a lot of the presupposition of faith, of a lot of presuppositions that we make is in the inerrancy of the Bible. And in any search or any inquiry that we do about these things, we assume that. And because we assume that, that is fact. But it shouldn't be a fact. It should be something that we interpret with an inquisitive and skeptical eye. And when we start with that assumption, like you said, that's the only belief that we can have. And that's, I think, my biggest issue here is that there is no even option for honest inquiry because we've already decided before we've began. So this whole cycle is meaningless when we've already decided. So all of our discussion here is moot. There's no point. So
I want to make sure there's a big difference between the inerrancy of the Bible and a possible errancy of the interpretation of the Bible. I think a big part of our trouble and our struggle and our confusion and our issues is that the biblical interpretation is very hard. And I would be the first to tell you, biblical interpretation could be wrong. However, saying that, the biblical text itself, based on what we know from the science of biblical transmission and the manuscript study, this is a completely different science, and I will tell you, go and do your research, that we can be almost absolutely sure, 100%, that we have the original text that was written in the first century. We know. However, saying that, yes, I'll give you that the interpretation could be troublesome. The problem at this point of what we're having is not that people are debating whether the biblical text is inerrant. They all read the same text. They are debating, as you will see tomorrow in the third lecture, different ways of interpretation. And this is another thing about presuppositions, is that the presupposition of a young earth creationist is that the biblical text has to be interpreted absolutely, 100% literal, without no ifs, ands, or buts. And they read the same text that somebody in the theistic evolution would read and will come up with a completely different answer. The issue is not with the text. The issue is with the interpretation. Where do we as a church fall on? Well, we fall on that the text is inerrant. And we fall on that the text is interpreted within a tradition. Within a tradition. Okay? There's one in the back. Let's just let her take a chance. Let her take a chance. I'll be around to answer any other questions. Just let her take a chance.
Thanks, and sorry for anybody whose question I took. Kind of jumping off of that, my question concerns the credibility of the Bible in terms of not necessarily its historical value and the sources that have been found, but more for its purpose. Essentially, why is it not used for political reasons in terms of within a tradition than faith? Essentially, why would we need the Bible if faith is supposed to be obvious.
Can you just repeat the question again? I'm not sure I got the question.
How can we trust the credibility of the Bible if it is a narrative given down for traditional purposes and not necessarily universally claimed? So why do, as Christians, we feel like we're special and we're chosen and that everybody else that isn't exposed to the Bible is going to get judged differently?
It's a great question. In any kind of debate or any kind of point where you are kind of a little bit confused, you have to have a starting point. You have to have a point of reference. When I look at the Bible is not necessarily giving facts that are related only to a certain culture or to a certain time. I think if I take the Bible in its complete stripped down facts, what does it tell me? It tells me that God exists. It tells me that God created me. It tells me that God created me on a big honor and an image like Him. And when I rejected God, He came after me. And He came after me to restore this relationship. And He came after me to restore this relationship in the person of Jesus Christ. These facts that the Bible gives me are facts that are timeless, are not related to a certain culture or a certain political period. Your question then becomes, well, what makes my claim different or better than any other claim of somebody claiming to reach God? And I'll put it this way. I can go only with what I know and tell people, what is your idea? What is your view of God? The view of God that I have in my interpretation and in my revelation is a very, very fulfilling God. It's a very, very fulfilling relationship. It's a very fulfilling wonder that gives me more than what I even have asked for. It gives me what John 10:10 talks about. I came that they may have life and they have it in abundance. And I would ask anyone who is otherwise, I'd ask him, your view of God, can it compare to that? If you're happy with the way that you view God, you want to view Him as a master and you're His slave, I respect that. But I'll also tell you, my view of God as a father, my view of God as a redeemer, as a savior, is far more fulfilling. I'll ask you another question. Your view of God, what kind of hope does it give you in such an evil world that is really tough to live in? If your view of your God gives you more hope, then live with it. But I would truly tell you that my view of my God that has been revealed to me gives me hope that can surpass all understanding. And that's what Peter talked about. Give ready to give a defense for everyone who asks you on the reason for what? The hope. It's not a matter of convincing. It's not a matter of a logic game. It's a matter when somebody sees you being pressed by illness, by sickness, by disease, by persecution, and you have such an amazing hope. It's a matter when somebody is holding a knife to you and your eyes are up on heaven and you don't even have a tear in your eyes and you're being chopped off in your head with complete faith. You know what that martyrdom of the 21 did? It showed people what hope is. In an evil world, what hope is. I don't think the answer to this question is a logical answer. I don't think the answer to this question is an answer of whose text is more authentic. Because my text exists, their text exists for, many years. I guess the question is that whose vision of God gives you more hope in this life and in eternity? If you are truly seeking an answer to this, I think you'll find hard not to say that our God that we worship is a God that is beyond all understanding. Okay? Done? Okay. Thank you very much. I'll be around and I'll be back tomorrow all day for more questions.